Sometimes the people you trust most are living the biggest lies. I discovered this at our annual family reunion, when my cousin Sarah grabbed my arm with trembling fingers and whispered words that would shatter everything I believed about my family. The aunt and uncle I'd loved and respected for 32 years, the ones who taught me about integrity, who attended every birthday and graduation, who seemed like the moral compass of our entire family, weren't who they claimed to be. Their real names weren't Janet and Robert Chen. They weren't retired teachers from San Francisco. They weren't even married. They're fugitives, Sarah had whispered, her eyes darting toward the laughing couple by the barbecue grill. They've been running from something for decades, and I just found out what I discovered next would force me to choose between protecting the family I thought I knew and exposing a truth that could destroy us all. The Miller family reunion happened every August at my parents' lake house in Wisconsin. It was our tradition. 3 generations gathering for a weekend of barbecues, board games, and catching up. This year felt extra special because it marked the 40th anniversary of Aunt Janet and Uncle Robert joining our family. I remember watching them that morning, setting up folding chairs with the same methodical precision they brought to everything. Aunt Janet, 67, with her silver hair always perfectly styled, arranging potato salad while humming softly. Uncle Robert, 69, manning the grill with his signature dad jokes and stories about his teaching days in California. They were the family anchors, the ones who remembered everyone's birthdays, who mediated disputes with gentle wisdom, who somehow always had the right advice at the right time. My own parents often deferred to their judgment on family matters. Ask Janet and Robert was practically our family motto. My cousin Sarah, Janet's sister's daughter, had driven up from Chicago that morning. She seemed unusually quiet during lunch, picking at her burger while shooting strange glances at our beloved aunt and uncle. I noticed her hands shaking slightly when she reached for her water glass, but I attributed it to caffeine or work stress. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the deck as kids splashed in the lake and adults settled into comfortable conversations. Everything felt wonderfully normal, safe, familiar. Looking back, I realized there had always been subtle oddities about Janet and Robert that we'd simply accepted as quirks. They never talked about their past before meeting our family. They had no old friends who visited, no college yearbooks or childhood photos. They paid for everything in cash and seemed genuinely uncomfortable when anyone brought up genealogy or family history research. But these were just Janet and Robert being Janet and Robert, private, humble people who preferred focusing on the present rather than dwelling on the past. At least, that's what we all believed. Around 4 p.m., I was helping my mom clear dessert plates when Sarah appeared at my elbow. Her face was pale, almost gray, and her grip on my arm was urgent enough to make me wince. "I need to talk to you." Now away from everyone. Her voice was barely a whisper, but the intensity in her eyes made my stomach drop. Sarah was typically the most laid-back person in our family. Seeing her this agitated was like watching a golden retriever suddenly bare its teeth. We walked to the far end of the dock, where the sounds of family laughter became a distant hum. Sarah kept looking over her shoulder, as if checking whether we were being followed or overheard. "They're not who you think they are," she said, her words tumbling out in a rush. "Janet and Robert. Their real names are Diana Kovich and Marcus Webb. They're wanted by the FBI." I actually laughed. The whole thing sounded like something from a bad movie. "Sarah, what are you talking about? That's insane. They're retired teachers from—" "No, they're not." She pulled out her phone with trembling fingers. "I've been working as a paralegal for a criminal defense firm in Chicago. Yesterday, I was researching a case involving old witness protection files that got unsealed, and I saw their faces. Different names, but definitely them. From 38 years ago." The world seemed to tilt slightly. The sounds of our family reunion, Uncle Robert's laughter, Aunt Janet calling kids in for sunscreen, suddenly felt surreal, like I was hearing them through water. "Show me," I managed to whisper. Sarah's phone screen displayed a grainy newspaper photo from 1985. The headline read, "Star Witnesses Disappear Before Major Organized Crime Trial." The faces were younger, the hair different colors, but there was no mistaking those eyes, that distinctive shape of Robert's jaw, Janet's elegant nose. My legs felt weak. I sank onto the wooden dock, staring at the image while my brain struggled to process what I was seeing. 38 years. They'd been living among us, loving us, being part of our most intimate family moments while carrying this massive secret. "There's more," Sarah said quietly. "According to the articles I found, they testified against a major crime family in New York. The trial fell apart when they disappeared, and several dangerous people went free because of it." The implications hit me like a physical blow. If Sarah was right, if our beloved aunt and uncle were living under false identities, what did that mean for our family? Were we in danger? Had we unknowingly been harboring fugitives for decades? I looked back toward the house where Aunt Janet was now playing cards with my teenage daughter, both of them laughing at some private joke. The disconnect between that tender scene and Sarah's revelation felt impossible to reconcile. "What do we do?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. To understand why Sarah's revelation felt like an earthquake, you need to know how Janet and Robert became the foundation of our family. They appeared in our lives in 1985, introduced by Janet's sister, Maria. Though Sarah's research now suggested Maria might have been another person in witness protection who'd been assigned to help them establish new identities. My parents, newly married and struggling financially, had immediately bonded with the older couple. Janet and Robert seemed to have endless wisdom about life, relationships, and managing money. They helped my parents buy their first house by co-signing the loan. They babysit me and my siblings countless times, never asking for anything in return. When I was 7, my father lost his job during a recession. Janet and Robert quietly took over our mortgage payments for 6 months, refusing to let my parents pay them back. "Family takes care of family," Aunt Janet had said, hugging my crying mother. "That's what we do." They attended every major milestone in our lives. Janet taught me to drive when I turned 16. Robert walked me down the aisle at my wedding when my own father was recovering from surgery. They were the first people I called when my daughter was born, and they drove through a blizzard to reach the hospital. But thinking back with this new knowledge, certain memories took on a different shade. Robert's reluctance to be photographed at family events. Janet's panic attack when a neighbor mentioned seeing someone who looked like her on a Most Wanted TV show. We'd attributed it to her dislike of those programs. But now, there was also the way they handled conflict within our family. When my uncle, Mom's brother, was going through a nasty divorce and making threats about getting even with his ex-wife, Janet and Robert had intervened with surprising authority. They'd sat him down and spoken to him privately for over an hour. He emerged looking shaken and never made another threat. At the time, we'd been impressed by their counseling skills. Now I wondered what they'd really said to him. They'd shaped our family's values around loyalty, discretion, and protecting each other at all costs. "What happens in the family stays in the family," was practically their motto. They'd taught us that sometimes keeping secrets was an act of love, that the outside world didn't always need to know everything about our private lives. Had they been preparing us, all along, to keep their secret if it ever came to light? Sarah's discovery meant that everything I thought I knew about my family's moral foundation was built on a lie. The people who'd taught us about honesty and integrity were living under false identities. The aunt and uncle who'd preached about facing consequences for our actions had been running from their own for nearly 4 decades, but they'd also been genuinely loving, sacrificing, and present for our family in ways that felt completely authentic. Could their love for us be real even if their identities were fake? Was it possible to be both a fugitive and a devoted family member? That evening, after the reunion officially ended and most family members had driven home, Sarah and I retreated to my childhood bedroom to research what she'd discovered. My parents, exhausted from hosting, had gone to bed early. Janet and Robert were staying in the guest room, as they had for countless reunions before. Sarah's laptop screen glowed in the dark room as we scrolled through archived newspaper articles and court documents. The story that emerged was more complex than either of us had imagined. In 1984, Diana Kovach had been a bookkeeper for a restaurant chain in Queens. Marcus Webb had been a construction foreman working on several of the chain's renovation projects. They'd discovered that the restaurants were fronts for money laundering operations connected to the Torino crime family, one of New York's most violent organized crime syndicates. Instead of looking the other way, they'd gone to the FBI with evidence of the laundering scheme. Their testimony was crucial to building a case against Anthony Torino Sr., the family patriarch, and several of his lieutenants. The trial was set to begin in March 1985. But 2 weeks before the trial, Diana and Marcus vanished. The prosecution's case collapsed without their testimony. Anthony Torino Sr. walked free, along with 6 other defendants. The FBI suspected the witnesses had been murdered, but their bodies were never found. "Look at this," Sarah whispered, pointing to a follow-up article from 1987. 3 people connected to the original case were found dead under suspicious circumstances. The FBI believes the Torino family was systematically eliminating anyone who might testify against them in future proceedings. The implications were staggering. Janet and Robert hadn't just been witnesses. They'd been the key witnesses whose disappearance had allowed dangerous criminals to remain free. For nearly 40 years, they'd been living with the knowledge that their decision to run had potentially put other innocent people at risk. But as we dug deeper, the moral landscape became even murkier. Another article, from 1986, revealed that 2 of the FBI agents handling the case had been arrested for corruption. They'd been feeding information to the Torino family about witness identities and locations. "Oh my God," I breathed, reading over Sarah's shoulder. They ran because they found out the FBI was compromised. They weren't just scared. They knew they were being betrayed by the people who were supposed to protect them. Sarah nodded grimly. "And look at this." She pulled up a more recent article from 2019. Anthony Torino Sr. died in federal prison. He was finally convicted on different charges in 2003. Most of his organization was dismantled by 2010. The immediate danger that had driven Janet and Robert into hiding might be gone, but they'd been living as different people for so long that returning to their original identities probably seemed impossible. They'd built an entire life, an entire family, around their assumed names. We heard footsteps in the hallway outside my bedroom door. Sarah quickly closed the laptop as we both froze, listening. The footsteps paused right outside my door for what felt like an eternity, then continued toward the bathroom. "They know we know something," Sarah whispered. "Did you see how Robert kept watching us during dinner?" And Janet asked me 3 times if everything was okay. I had noticed. Janet's usually warm demeanor had seemed strained around Sarah and me. Robert had been uncharacteristically quiet, his usual stream of dad jokes conspicuously absent. The next morning brought a new complication. My mom mentioned over breakfast that she'd been contacted by a genealogy researcher who was putting together a comprehensive family tree. They specifically wanted to interview Janet and Robert about their family history in California. "They seemed so excited about it," Mom said brightly, though Janet looked a little overwhelmed. "I think she's just not used to that much attention." Sarah and I exchanged glances. If a researcher started digging into Janet and Robert's supposed past in California, their carefully constructed identities could unravel very quickly. Later that morning, I found Robert sitting alone on the dock, staring out at the lake. He looked older than I'd ever seen him, the weight of invisible burdens etched in the lines of his face. "Beautiful morning," I said, settling into the chair beside him. "Yes," he replied, but his voice carried a sadness that made my chest tighten. "Some of the most beautiful moments come right before everything changes." The statement felt loaded with meaning. Was he trying to tell me something? Did he know that Sarah had uncovered their secret? "Robert," I began carefully, "is there anything you want to tell me? Anything you think I should know?" He was quiet for so long that I thought he might not answer. Finally, he turned to look at me with eyes that seemed to carry decades of carefully guarded secrets. "Sometimes the hardest thing about loving people is knowing when to trust them with the truth," he said softly. "And sometimes, the most loving thing you can do is carry certain burdens alone." Before I could respond, Janet appeared on the deck, calling us in for lunch. The moment passed, but Robert's words echoed in my mind. Was he asking me to keep carrying his secret? Or was he preparing to finally share the burden he'd been carrying for nearly 4 decades? That afternoon, while my parents were napping and most of the extended family had gone home, I decided I couldn't carry the weight of Sarah's discovery any longer. I found Janet and Robert cleaning up the kitchen, moving with the comfortable synchronization of a couple who'd worked side by side for decades. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "All of us, including Sarah." Janet's hands stilled on the dish she was drying. Robert set down the pan he'd been scrubbing and turned to face me fully. In that moment, I saw something shift in both their expressions, a kind of resigned recognition that their carefully guarded secret was about to be exposed. "Sarah," I called toward the living room, "can you come in here, please?" When Sarah appeared in the kitchen doorway, laptop tucked under her arm, the silence became electric. Janet and Robert seemed to age 10 years in the span of a few seconds. "Diana Kovich and Marcus Webb," I said quietly. "Should we start there, or would you prefer to keep pretending you're retired teachers from San Francisco?" Janet, Diana, made a sound that was half gasp, half sob. Her legs seemed to give out, and she sank into one of the kitchen chairs. Robert, Marcus, moved immediately to stand behind her, his hands protective on her shoulders. "How long have you known?" Robert asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Since yesterday," Sarah said, opening her laptop. "I work for a law firm. I came across sealed witness protection files that were recently unsealed. I saw your pictures from the Torino case." Robert closed his eyes and exhaled slowly, as if he'd been holding his breath for 38 years. "We always knew this day might come." "Why?" I asked, and the word came out more broken than I'd intended. "Why didn't you trust us? Why live this lie with people who love you?" Janet looked up at me with tears streaming down her face. "Because we love you too much to put you in danger. Because the moment we told you the truth, you'd become accessories. Because we've been living in terror for almost 40 years that our past would destroy the only real family we've ever known." "Tell us everything," Sarah said, setting the laptop on the kitchen table. "The whole truth, this time." So they did. For the next 2 hours, Janet and Robert, Diana and Marcus, told us about discovering the money laundering, about going to the FBI, about learning that their handlers were corrupt, and that the Torino family knew their real names and where they lived. "We had 12 hours, Robert said, his voice steady but haunted. 12 hours from when Diana's FBI contact warned us that our cover was blown until we had to disappear completely. We left everything, our families, our friends, our entire lives. The hardest part," Janet added, "wasn't losing our old lives. It was building new ones, knowing they were built on lies, But then we met your parents, and you kids came along, and suddenly we had something worth protecting again. But the criminals who threatened you are mostly dead or in prison now, Sarah pointed out, showing them articles on her laptop. Anthony Torino Sr. died in 2019. His organization was dismantled years ago. Why keep hiding? Janet and Robert exchanged a look that spoke of countless private conversations about this very question. Because Diana Kovich and Marcus Webb are legally dead, Robert said finally. We can't just resurrect identities that were officially buried. And Janet and Robert Chen aren't just names to us anymore. They're who we became when we chose love over fear. Besides, Janet added, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand, our old lives didn't have you in them. This life, even built on a lie, gave us the greatest truth we've ever known. That family isn't just about blood or shared history. It's about choosing to love each other every single day. I felt my own tears starting. The people I'd loved and admired my entire life were both exactly who I'd thought they were, and completely different. They were fugitives and heroes, liars and truth-tellers, strangers and family. So what happens now? I asked. Do we pretend this conversation never happened? Do we call the FBI? Do we tell the rest of the family? The question hung in the air like a challenge, and I realized that how we answered it would define not just Janet and Robert's future, but the moral foundation of our entire family. The conversation that followed was the most emotionally intense of my life. We sat around that kitchen table until nearly midnight, grappling with questions that had no clear answers. Should we report Janet and Robert to authorities? Did we have a moral obligation to the justice system, or to the family who'd loved and supported us for decades? Sarah, with her legal background, argued that we needed to contact the FBI. They've been living under false identities for almost 40 years, she said. That's identity fraud, regardless of the circumstances that led to it. And what about the genealogy researcher who's looking into their background? If we don't handle this proactively, it could expose not just them, but all of us. I found myself torn between my love for Janet and Robert and my sense of right and wrong. They'd committed crimes, technically speaking, but they'd also been abandoned by the system that was supposed to protect them. And in the years since, they'd been nothing but positive forces in our family. What about the people who died because the Torino family went free? I asked. Don't we owe something to their families too? Robert's face crumpled at that question. Not a day goes by that I don't think about that, he said. We made an impossible choice in an impossible situation. We could stay and probably die, allowing the truth to die with us. Or we could run and live with the guilt of knowing our absence let criminals go free. Janet reached for his hand. We've donated anonymously to victim support organizations for years. It doesn't bring anyone back, but it's how we've tried to balance the scales. The immediate practical concerns were overwhelming. My parents needed to know. They'd been unknowingly harboring fugitives for nearly 4 decades. But how do you tell your aging parents that the people they consider their closest friends have been lying about their fundamental identities for longer than I've been alive? There was also the rest of our extended family to consider. Cousins, siblings, in-laws, all of whom had relationships with Janet and Robert built on false premises. Did they deserve to know the truth? Did we have the right to make that decision for them? And then there were the legal implications Sarah had raised. If Janet and Robert were discovered by authorities, could our family be charged with harboring fugitives? We'd been unknowing accomplices, but would that matter in court? By midnight, we'd reached a tentative agreement. Sarah would research the current legal landscape around witness protection and identity fraud, focusing on cases with similar circumstances. Janet and Robert would consult with a criminal defense attorney, discreetly, about the possibility of voluntary surrender and the potential consequences. Most importantly, we agreed that my parents needed to know the truth before any other decisions were made. They deserve the chance to process this information and have input on how to handle it. The conversation with my parents 2 days later was heartbreaking. My mother cried for hours, not because she felt betrayed, but because she was devastated that Janet and Robert had been carrying such fear and pain alone for so long. "They're not criminals," she kept saying. "They're heroes who got abandoned by the system they tried to help. How can we abandon them too?" My father was more practical, but equally supportive. "We've known them for 38 years, he said. "We know who they are, regardless of what names they use. That doesn't change because we know their history now." The genealogy researcher issue resolved itself when Janet and Robert politely declined to participate, citing privacy concerns. The researcher was disappointed but not suspicious. Apparently, many older adults are reluctant to share detailed family information with strangers. But the deeper questions remained unresolved. We were now a family carrying a massive secret, complicit in an ongoing deception that could have legal consequences for all of us. Every family gathering, every holiday, every casual conversation carried the weight of hidden knowledge. 6 months have passed since that family reunion, and I'm still processing what Sarah's discovery has taught me about truth, loyalty, and the complexity of moral choices. The experience has fundamentally changed how I think about right and wrong, family obligations, and the stories we tell ourselves about the people we love. I've learned that love and deception can coexist in ways that challenge every simple moral framework I once believed in. Janet and Robert's love for our family was never fake, even though their identities were. Their sacrifices, their presence at crucial moments, their genuine care and concern, all of that was real, regardless of the names they used or the history they concealed. But I've also learned that living with secrets changes you. Knowing what I know now has made me hyper-aware of how many small deceptions we all carry, how many partial truths we tell to protect ourselves and others. Every time someone asks about Janet and Robert's background, every time they appear in family photos that might be shared publicly, I feel the weight of complicity. The experience has made me more empathetic to people facing impossible choices. Before this, I might have judged Janet and Robert harshly for running instead of staying to testify. Now I understand that they were caught between competing moral obligations, their duty to justice, and their right to survive. Neither choice was purely right or wrong. I've also gained a deeper appreciation for the courage it takes to build a life after losing everything. Janet and Robert didn't just change their names, they had to become entirely different people while somehow staying true to their core values. The fact that they became such loving, generous family members suggests that their assumed identities allowed them to express their best selves rather than hiding their worst. Most importantly, I've learned that family loyalty isn't about blind acceptance of everything your loved ones do. It's about choosing to love people despite their flaws, mistakes, and complicated histories. Janet and Robert earned our loyalty through decades of consistent love and support. That foundation doesn't disappear because we learned they were living under assumed names. Sarah eventually decided not to report Janet and Robert to authorities, concluding that the statute of limitations on their original charges had likely expired and that their voluntary cooperation with a new investigation wouldn't serve justice in any meaningful way. Instead, she helped them consult with an attorney who confirmed that they could potentially apply for legal amnesty given the corruption in their original case. We still don't know what the future holds. Janet and Robert are considering the legal route to legitimize their identities, but it's a complex process that could take years. In the meantime, we continue as we always have, as a family that chooses love over judgment, understanding over condemnation. So here's my question for you. Did we make the right choice? Should we have immediately reported Janet and Robert to authorities, regardless of our personal feelings? Were we wrong to prioritize family loyalty over legal obligations? Some days I'm confident we chose compassion over rigid rule following, and that feels right. Other days I wonder if we're enabling a decades long deception that could have broader consequences we haven't considered. What would you have done in our situation? How do you balance love for family members against legal and moral obligations to society? Is there ever a time when keeping someone's secret is more important than exposing their lies? I genuinely want to hear your perspectives. Leave a comment below and tell me, did we go too far in protecting them, or not far enough in seeking justice? How would you handle loving someone whose entire identity was built on a lie?